The cabin stood alone on the Dakota Prairie, 20 miles from the nearest settlement. Most folks who passed by shook their heads. They called it wasteful, called it foolish. Some called the man who built it worse things than that. What they saw didn't make sense to them. While every other settler in Dakota Territory was racing to throw up the quickest, cheapest shelter before winter, this man was still working on his cabin in late September. While others built single-wall structures 12 feet square, his measured 16 by 20. While they used logs barely 8 inches thick, his were a foot across. And strangest of all, he was building 2 walls where one should do. The mockery started in August 1880, when he first arrived to claim his homestead. His name was Thomas Erickson, a Norwegian immigrant who'd worked 3 years in the lumber camps of Wisconsin before filing his claim. He was 32 years old, unmarried, and folks said he was too cautious for frontier life, too slow, too particular. They said he'd never prove up his claim. They said he'd be on the first train back to Wisconsin come spring. They said a lot of things. Then October 15th, 1880 came, and everything changed. The blizzard hit Dakota Territory without warning. It was early. Too early. The first snow should have held off until November, maybe late October at the earliest. Instead, 3 feet of snow fell in a single day. Temperatures dropped to 20 below zero. The wind screamed across the prairie at 40 miles an hour. That blizzard was the opening blow of what would become known as the hard winter, or the long winter. 7 months of cold that would rewrite what settlers thought was possible. 7 months that would kill cattle by the hundreds of thousands. 7 months that would strand entire towns when the railroads stopped running. 7 months that would test every structure, every preparation, every decision made in the warm months before. And Thomas Erickson's cabin, the one they'd mocked, would become a matter of life and death for more people than just himself. Most homestead cabins in Dakota Territory in 1880 followed the same basic pattern. The Homestead Act required structures to be at least 10 feet by 12 feet. Most settlers built exactly that size, not an inch larger. Why waste lumber or effort? The walls were single-thickness logs, typically 6 to 8 inches in diameter. Corners were notched using simple saddle joints. The gaps between logs were chinked with mud mixed with prairie grass. A sod roof kept out most of the rain. One small window, often covered with greased paper instead of glass. A dirt floor may be covered with split logs if the settler had extra time. A stone fireplace at one end. Total construction time for a man working alone, about 2 to 3 weeks. Total cost, maybe $15 to $20 for the filing fee, the few nails needed, and whatever couldn't be found on the land itself. These cabins worked fine for moderate winters. The previous decade had been unusually mild across the Great Plains. Settlers who arrived in the late 1870s had experienced winters that were cold, certainly, but manageable. Snow that melted by early March. Enough mild days between storms that cattle could graze. Trains that kept running, bringing supplies and mail. The typical homestead cabin could keep a family alive in those winters. The logs provided some insulation. A good fire in the fireplace warmed the single room to tolerable temperatures. The structure kept out the wind and most of the snow. It was enough. Thomas Erickson had seen different winters. In Norway, in the mountains where he grew up, cold meant something else entirely. Cold meant months where the temperature never rose above freezing, where snow piled 12 feet deep, where a poorly built house meant death. He'd also worked 3 winters in the Wisconsin lumber camps. He'd seen what happened when men tried to survive in structures that weren't adequate. He'd helped pull frozen bodies from shanties that looked perfectly sound from the outside. He understood something most Dakota settlers didn't yet know. There's cold, and then there's killing cold. And you don't know which one you're building for until it's too late to fix your mistakes. So when he filed his homestead claim in June 1880, he'd already made his decisions. He would build slow, he would build right, and he would ignore anyone who called him a fool for it. The site he chose told the first part of the story. Most settlers picked flat, open ground. Easy to build on. Easy to plow come spring. Erickson walked his entire 160 acres before choosing a spot in a slight depression, sheltered on the north and west by a low rise. The prairie wind, which blows predominantly from the northwest, would hit that rise and lift over his cabin. Not much, maybe just enough to matter. But in a Dakota winter, enough to matter could mean enough to survive. He started by hauling stones. Hundreds of stones, pulled from the creek bed a quarter-mile away and from the rocky soil of his land. He built a foundation that extended 2 feet below ground level and rose 1 foot above it. Every other cabin sat on 4 corner stones, maybe 6. His sat on a continuous stone foundation. The extra work took him 2 weeks. 2 weeks when he could have been cutting logs. 2 weeks that had his neighbors laughing. The logs came next. He cut them from the cottonwood and elm trees along the creek. Most settlers cut whatever was closest. Erickson walked the creek for 2 miles in each direction, selecting specific trees. He wanted logs at least 12 inches in diameter, as straight as possible, with minimal branching. When he found a good tree, he marked it. When he'd marked enough, he started cutting. Each log was stripped of bark immediately after felling. Bark holds moisture, invites rot, and provides homes for insects. Then each log sat for 2 weeks before he dragged it to the building site. This drove his neighbors to distraction. Why wait? The log would season eventually. Why not build now and let them season in place? Because wood shrinks as it dries. A green log loses up to 10% of its diameter. Gaps open between logs. Chinking fails. Cold air pours in. Erickson had seen it happen. He wasn't going to let it happen to him. By early August, he had 40 logs ready. He began building. The first course went down on the stone foundation, the logs notched at the corners using dovetail joints. More work than saddle notches, but stronger. Much stronger. Less likely to separate when the logs shrank. Then came the innovation that made his neighbors certain he'd lost his mind. He built the walls double thickness. The inner wall rose first, 12-inch logs carefully fitted and chinked. When that wall reached 7 feet, he stopped. Then he began the outer wall, 3 feet outside the first. Another set of 12-inch logs rising parallel to the inner wall. Between the 2 walls, he packed sawdust. He'd arranged with a sawmill 60 miles away to deliver 12 wagon loads of sawdust, payment to be made after harvest. The sawmill owner thought he was crazy, but took his money anyway. The sawdust arrived in mid-August, and Erickson began filling the 3-foot gap between his inner and outer walls. Sawdust was known to be good insulation. A few frontier families used it in attic spaces. But a 3-foot thick sawdust wall? That was beyond excessive. That was wasteful. That was the work of a man too scared of cold to be a real pioneer. The comments reached Erickson. His nearest neighbor, a man named William Crawford, whose claim adjoined his to the south, made a special trip to see the construction. Crawford was 45, a veteran of the Civil War, and a man used to speaking his mind. "You building a fort or a house?" Crawford asked. "A house," Erickson replied, not pausing in his work. "Seems like you're planning for an army to attack instead of just winter." "Winter can be an army." Crawford shook his head. "You know what all this is costing you? Time, money, both. My cabin was done in 3 weeks. Cost me $18 total. You've been at this 2 months and spent what, $100? More? Something like that. And you're still not done. First snow might come early this year. You'll be working in cold weather trying to finish." "Then I'll finish in cold weather." Crawford walked around the structure, examining the double walls, the stone foundation, the careful notching. Finally he said, "It's your money and your time, but seems to me you could have had a cabin and a barn done by now if you'd built sensible. What's the point of a house that's so expensive you can't afford anything else?" Erickson looked up from his work. "The point is being alive come spring to afford other things." Crawford rode away, shaking his head. The story spread. That Norwegian fellow building the fort, wasting his grubstake on a cabin that could survive a cannon blast but wouldn't help him farm. Too scared of cold to make it out here. Probably head back east before Christmas. The cabin continued rising. The outer wall took shape. the space between filled with sawdust, packed carefully to eliminate air gaps. By mid-September, the walls stood complete, 7 feet high on the inner wall, 8 feet on the outer. The difference created a ledge that would support the roof structure. For the roof, Erickson built a double layer. Rough-cut boards on heavy rafters, then a thick layer of sod, then another layer of boards, then another layer of sod, then finally tar paper over the top. 4 layers instead of the usual 1 or 2. The weight was enormous. The rafters were twice as thick as normal to support it. More wasted wood, his neighbors said. More excessive caution. By late September, the basic structure was complete. But Erickson kept working. He built a stone floor instead of packed earth, hauling and placing thousands of small stones to create a surface that could be swept clean. He constructed a massive fireplace with a chimney built from mortared stone that extended 3 feet above the roof peak. He installed a real glass window, small but functional, with shutters inside and out. He built a second, smaller inner door, creating an airlock entry. He chinked every gap in both walls with a mixture of clay, sand, and fine grass, then chinked them again after the first layer dried. October arrived. The work continued. A small barn rose near the cabin, single wall but well built. A root cellar dug deep into the hillside and lined with stone. Storage for firewood, protected from snow. Every day, Erickson cut and stacked more wood. By October 14th, he had enough firewood to fill the space between his cabin and barn, cords upon cords of split cottonwood and elm. His neighbors had stopped commenting. They figured he was done making a fool of himself and would learn his lesson when winter came. Some felt sorry for him. All that work, all that expense. For a first winter, he probably wouldn't finish anyway. The frontier sorted people. The strong stayed, the cautious left. Thomas Erickson, they figured, would leave. October 15th, 1880, dawned cold. Unusually cold for mid-October. By noon, snow began falling, light at first, then heavier. By evening, a full blizzard raged across Dakota Territory. The wind howled at speeds that made standing upright difficult. Snow fell so thick, a man couldn't see his hand at arm's length. Temperature dropped to 20 below zero. The blizzard lasted 3 days. When it finally cleared on October 18th, the prairie landscape had transformed. Snow drifted 15 feet deep in places. Livestock that had been caught in the open lay frozen in the fields. Several settlers who'd been checking their animals when the storm hit didn't make it back to their cabins. The bodies wouldn't be found until spring. William Crawford's cabin survived, but barely. The wind had found every gap in the chinking. The single-thickness walls provided minimal protection. He and his wife had huddled by the fireplace for 3 days, burning everything they could to stay warm. They made it through, but just barely. When Crawford finally dug out his door on the 19th, the first thing he did was look across the snow-covered prairie toward Erickson's cabin. The cabin stood solid. Smoke rose from the chimney, steady and undisturbed by the wind. The structure showed no damage. The carefully chinked walls had held. The double-layer roof had shed the snow without sagging. Crawford thought about the 3 days he'd just survived. The cold that penetrated his cabin despite the fire. The wind that found every crack. The certainty he'd felt at certain moments that they wouldn't make it. Then he thought about Erickson in that thick-walled cabin, and he understood. But that was just the first storm. October brought 2 more blizzards. November brought 4. December brought 5. The temperature never rose above zero for weeks at a time. The wind never stopped. Snow kept falling, and the railroad stopped running. That was the real disaster. The trains brought supplies, mail, news, hope. They brought flour and sugar and coffee. They brought kerosene for lamps. They brought everything a settler couldn't produce on their own land. When the train stopped, the town stopped functioning. By Christmas, De Smet, the nearest town to Erickson's claim, was in crisis. The last train had arrived in mid-December. The next train, scheduled for December 20th, never came. Then the next one didn't come. Then the next one. The snow had covered the tracks so deeply that the railroad couldn't clear them. They tried. They sent crews with shovels. The crews made it a few miles, then turned back, defeated by snow that in some places buried the rails 20 feet deep. They sent a locomotive to punch through the drifts. It made it 12 miles before getting stuck. A second locomotive sent to rescue the first also got stuck. Both had to be abandoned until spring. No trains meant no supplies. The stores in De Smet sold out of flour by early January. Coffee was gone by mid-January. Sugar disappeared. Kerosene for lamps ran out. Families began grinding wheat in their coffee mills just to have something to eat. They twisted hay into tight bundles to burn for heat when firewood ran out. They rationed everything, hoping the trains would start running before the supplies ran out completely. Some families didn't make it. The exact number of deaths during the hard winter was never fully documented, but estimates range from dozens to hundreds across Dakota Territory. Some froze in their inadequate shelters. Some starved when supplies ran out. Some died of diseases that mild winters would have let them survive. Thomas Erickson's cabin became a beacon of survival. It started in late January. A settler named Peter Johnson, who'd claimed land 5 miles north of Erickson, ran out of firewood. His cabin was the standard construction. Single wall, sod roof, barely adequate in a normal winter, lethal in this one. His wife was sick with pneumonia. His 3 children were showing signs of frostbite. The temperature hadn't risen above 20 below in a week. Johnson loaded his family onto a sled and headed south through snow that was waist-deep. He was heading for De Smet, hoping to find shelter in town. But the journey was too much. His wife couldn't make it. The children couldn't make it. Johnson was about to turn back when he saw smoke rising from Erickson's chimney. He changed direction toward the smoke. When he reached the cabin and knocked on the door, Erickson opened it immediately. Warm air poured out. Real warmth, the kind that had been missing from the Johnson cabin for weeks. Erickson took one look at the frozen family and pulled them inside. The cabin was warm, not just bearable, but genuinely warm. The fire in the massive stone fireplace burned steadily. The double walls kept the heat in so effectively that the room temperature stayed comfortable even when the fire burned low. The sawdust insulation, 3 feet thick, acted as a barrier that even the killing cold outside couldn't penetrate. Mrs. Johnson was placed in Erickson's own bed, piled with blankets. The children were wrapped in quilts and placed by the fire. Erickson made hot food, simple but nourishing. The family stayed 3 days. By the time they left, Mrs. Johnson's pneumonia had broken. The children's frostbite had stopped progressing. Johnson tried to thank Erickson, but words weren't adequate. Instead, he promised to send anyone else in trouble. Then he made a decision. He wasn't going to his inadequate cabin. He would take his family to town, stay with relatives there, and wait out the winter. His cabin could stand empty. Survival mattered more than proving up a claim. As he left, Johnson asked, "How much firewood do you have left?" Erickson smiled slightly. "Enough?" The word spread. There was a cabin that could stand against the winter, a place that stayed warm, a Norwegian fellow who'd built it right. 2 weeks later, another family arrived, then another. Then a single man who'd been caught between settlements when a blizzard hit and found Erickson's cabin by following the smoke. Erickson turned no one away. The cabin that had been mocked became a place of refuge. At times, 12 people sheltered there, crowded but warm. Erickson shared his food stores, carefully managed to last through the supplies he'd laid in the fall. He shared his firewood, which he'd cut in such massive quantities that even supporting multiple families, it lasted. Most importantly, he shared the warmth that his double walls and careful construction made possible. William Crawford came in March, not seeking shelter, but to talk. The winter had broken him. His wife had died in February. Pneumonia and cold combined. He'd survived, but barely. His cabin had become a place of suffering. He stood in Erickson's cabin, feeling the warmth, seeing the people who'd found refuge there. Finally he said, "I called you a fool." "I remember," Erickson replied. "I was wrong. You had good reason to think what you thought. Most winters, my cabin would be wasteful." "This isn't most winters." "No, it isn't." Crawford looked around the cabin again. The thick walls, the massive fireplace, the attention to every detail. Then he said, "How did you know? How did you know to build for this?" Erickson considered his answer. "I didn't know this exact winter would come, but I knew that bad winters happen. I'd seen them, and I knew that when they come, there's no second chance to build better. You build for the worst you can imagine and hope you're wrong. If you're wrong, you wasted some effort. If you're right, you saved your life." The hard winter finally broke in April 1881. The temperature rose above freezing for the first time in 7 months. Snow began melting. The railroad crews fought their way through the remaining drifts. On April 22nd, the first train reached De Smet since December. People gathered at the depot to cheer. The supplies that arrived saved those who'd made it through. Flour, coffee, sugar, kerosene, all the small comforts that had been missing for months. But for many, the supplies came too late. The territory had suffered. Estimates suggested that up to 30% of settlers who'd been in Dakota Territory in October 1880 were gone by May 1881. Some had died. Most had simply given up and left. Thomas Erickson stayed. He proved up his claim in 1885, gaining full ownership of his 160 acres. His cabin, the one that had been mocked, became famous throughout the territory. When new settlers arrived, old-timers would tell them the story. That Norwegian fellow who built the cabin that survived the long winter. The man who'd sheltered dozens when everyone thought he was a fool. The lessons from that winter changed how people built in Dakota Territory. The cabins that went up after 1881 were different. Thicker walls became common. Stone foundations became standard. Better chinking. More attention to insulation. Larger firewood storage. The casual attitude that had prevailed before the hard winter disappeared. People built seriously now. They built for survival. Erickson himself became sought after for advice. Settlers would visit his claim, examine his cabin, ask questions about every detail. How thick should walls be? What's the best chinking material? How much firewood is enough? He answered every question patiently. He never said, "I told you so," though he would have been justified. Instead, he helped people understand the principles. Build for the worst. Don't cut corners on shelter. Take your time to do it right. In 1883, Erickson married a Norwegian woman named Ingrid, who'd arrived in Dakota Territory with her family in 1882. They raised 6 children in that cabin. The structure stood for 70 years before being dismantled in 1950 when the family built a modern house. When the cabin came down, the walls were examined. The sawdust insulation, packed in 1880, was still dry and functional. The logs showed minimal rot. The construction had been so sound that with proper maintenance, the cabin could have stood another 70 years. Parts of the cabin were preserved. The main door now sits in the Heritage Museum in Pierre, South Dakota. Several logs were saved and are displayed at the Dakota Territorial Museum. The massive hearthstone from the fireplace marks the original cabin site, where a historical marker now explains the story. The winter of 1880-1881 appears in historical records as one of the most severe winters in American history. Meteorological data, where it exists, shows temperature and snowfall records that stood for decades. The accumulated winter season severity index, a modern calculation applied to historical data, ranks the hard winter among the top 5 most severe winters in the central United States since record-keeping began. The human cost was documented in homestead records. The number of active homestead claims in Dakota Territory dropped by 28% between October 1880 and October 1881. Some claims were simply abandoned. Others were officially withdrawn when families gave up and left. The population boom that had been filling Dakota Territory slowed dramatically. People reconsidered moving to a place where winter could kill. But those who stayed, who learned the lessons, who built better, they thrived. They became the foundation of what would eventually become South Dakota, admitted to the Union in 1889. The communities that grew from those early settlers carried forward the understanding that survival required preparation, that shortcuts in construction could be fatal. that the mockery of neighbors mattered less than the integrity of your walls. The story of Thomas Erickson's cabin touches something deeper than just building techniques. It speaks to the tension between innovation and tradition, between caution and courage, between the quick way and the right way. The settlers who mocked Erickson weren't bad people. They were following the accepted wisdom of their time. Build fast, build cheap, start farming quickly. That approach had worked in milder climates. It had worked in previous Dakota winters. They had every reason to think it would keep working. Erickson had something they didn't. He had the memory of worse winters. He had the experience of seeing people die from inadequate shelter. He had the imagination to understand that conditions could be worse than anything Dakota Territory had shown so far. So he built not for the winters he'd seen in Dakota, but for the winters he'd seen in Norway. For the killing cold he knew existed, even if others didn't believe it would come here. When that winter arrived, the difference between his preparation and theirs became the difference between life and death. The frontier sorted people mercilessly. It killed those who were unlucky. It killed those who were unprepared. It tested everyone's assumptions about what was necessary for survival. And occasionally, it vindicated those who'd been called fools for being too cautious. Modern survival experts study the hard winter as a case study in preparation. The lessons remain relevant. Don't assume the future will resemble the recent past. Don't mistake luck for adequate preparation. Don't let the mockery of others prevent you from doing what you believe is necessary. Build for the worst case, not the average case. Take the time to do things right, even when others insist you're wasting time. The cabin that Thomas Erickson built wasn't just a structure. It was a statement of principles. Those principles saved lives in the winter of 1880 and 1881. They shaped construction practices for generations. They stand as a reminder that sometimes the person everyone calls a fool is the only one seeing clearly. William Crawford, whose wife died in his inadequate cabin, rebuilt in 1882. His new cabin featured double walls with sawdust insulation. He consulted with Erickson on every aspect of the construction. When it was finished, Crawford said to Erickson, "I built the cabin you would have built. I just wish I'd done it the first time." That sentiment echoed across Dakota Territory. Wish I'd built better. Wish I'd taken more time. Wish I'd listened to that Norwegian fellow instead of calling him a fool. The wishes came too late for those who died, but they informed the decisions of everyone who built after the hard winter. The legacy of Erickson's cabin extended beyond construction techniques. It became a story told to children as they grew. A lesson in trusting your own judgment when everyone disagrees. A reminder that being different isn't the same as being wrong. A proof that sometimes the unpopular choice is the right choice. Dakota Territory grew into South Dakota, transformed from frontier to state. The harsh conditions that tested early settlers gradually became less deadly as infrastructure improved, as communities established support systems, as knowledge spread about what was required to survive there. But the memory of the hard winter remained. The old-timers never forgot. They told their children, who told their children, who told theirs. The cabin that stood when others failed. The man who built it right when everyone said he was wrong. The winter that killed those who weren't prepared and spared those who were. The vindication of caution over haste. These stories mattered because they carried forward a fundamental truth. Survival often depends on decisions made long before the crisis arrives. By the time you know you needed better shelter, it's too late to build it. By the time you know you needed more firewood, it's too late to cut it. By the time you realize your neighbors were wrong to mock you, everyone's too busy surviving to care who was right. Thomas Erickson understood this. He built his cabin in the summer for the worst that winter could bring. When that worst arrived, his preparation meant survival, not just for himself, but for everyone his cabin sheltered. In 1920, at age 72, Erickson was interviewed by a newspaper reporter writing about the 40th anniversary of the hard winter. The reporter asked him how it felt to have been proven right after being called a fool. Erickson's answer was characteristic. "I wasn't trying to be right. I was trying to survive. If everyone else had been right and I'd built too much, I would have wasted some time and money. But I'd have survived anyway. The way it happened, they were wrong, and I was right, and I survived while many didn't. I'd rather have wasted effort than lost life. The reporter asked what advice he'd give to young people building homes. Build for the worst winter that could happen, not the worst winter that has happened. Those are different things. The worst winter that has happened, you know about. The worst winter that could happen, you have to imagine. Use your imagination. Build for that. That advice, given in 1920, applies to more than building cabins. It applies to any preparation for any crisis. The future might be worse than the past. The trends might change. The conditions might shift. What worked yesterday might fail tomorrow. The only safety lies in preparing for conditions worse than you've experienced. The settlers who built quickly and cheaply in 1880 weren't stupid. They were responding to the immediate pressures they faced. They needed shelter now. They needed to start farming now. They needed to prove up their claims before their money ran out. Everything pushed them toward the quick solution, the adequate solution, the solution that had worked for others. Erickson felt those same pressures. He ignored them. He built slowly, carefully, excessively by the standards of his time. His neighbors thought he was wasting his grubstake. They thought he'd run out of money before proving up his claim. They thought his caution would be his downfall. Instead, his caution was his salvation, and the salvation of everyone his cabin sheltered when the winter they couldn't imagine became the winter they had to survive. The cabin stood as a monument to preparation, to foresight, to the courage required to ignore mockery and follow your own judgment. It stood for 70 years, outlasting most of the settlers who'd called it excessive. When it finally came down, it was not because it had failed. It came down because the family built a bigger house and no longer needed it. The old cabin, the fool's cabin, the cabin that had saved lives in the long winter, had done its job and more. The hearthstone that marks the site now sits on private land, but the family allows visitors. People still come to see where the cabin stood. Descendants of those who sheltered there during the hard winter make pilgrimages. Historians studying frontier survival visit. Builders interested in traditional construction techniques examine the remaining logs in museums. And all of them learn the same lesson. When everyone tells you you're wrong, you still might be right. When everyone mocks your caution, that caution might save your life. When everyone insists that adequate is enough, excessive might be what survival requires. Thomas Erickson's cabin proved all of that, not through argument or persuasion, but through the simple fact of standing when others fell, through staying warm when others froze, through sheltering life when others faced death. The settlers mocked his fool's cabin. Then it survived the harshest winter on record, and in surviving, it taught a lesson that echoes across generations. Build not for the expected, but for the possible. Prepare not for the likely, but for the worst you can imagine. And when others mock your preparation, remember that their mockery matters less than your survival. That lesson, learned in the brutal winter of 1880-1881, remains as relevant now as it was then. Crises come, conditions change, the worst case happens. And when it does, the difference between those who prepared excessively and those who prepared adequately becomes the difference between survival and catastrophe. The cabin stood. The people who sheltered there survived. And the story endures, a reminder carved in sawdust and stone that sometimes the fool is the only wise man in the room.